The winter wind scraped across the schoolyard like a blade, carrying with it the sharp scent of smoke, frozen earth, and a silence so heavy it felt inherited from the ruins of the war itself. 8-year-old Franz Bauer stood in the cold with his younger sister Greta beside him, their empty tin bowls clutched to their chests as if they were fragile pieces of hope that might shatter if handled without reverence. Frost clung to the rims like pale cuffs of ice, and Franz kept rubbing his thumb along the metal to warm it, even though his breath puffed in thin gray clouds that vanished before they could linger. He knew why they were here. Every child in Bad Kreuznach knew, but the knowledge didn't make the wait any easier. The schoolhouse behind them, once a place of chalk dust and laughter, had become a distribution point for whatever food might arrive, though in recent weeks that meant almost nothing. 4 days, their diet had been thin slices of stale bread, each piece rationed with mathematical precision. Even Greta no longer complained. Hunger had taught her silence. Franz tried to stand straighter, pretending he didn't feel the marrow-deep cold creeping into his bones, but Greta leaned against him, her face half hidden behind her wool scarf. The fabric was frayed, patched twice by their mother, and carried the faint smell of their home, burned potato peels and damp firewood. She was only 6, yet she carried herself with the resignation of someone much older, her cheeks hollowed, her lips faintly cracked. He reached out with his free hand and tucked a loose curl of her hair behind her ear. "We won't be here long," he whispered, though he had no evidence to support the promise. Greta nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the empty road stretching past the schoolyard gate, as if she feared that looking away might chase off whatever miracle they were waiting for. Germany in the winter of 1946 was a landscape trapped between broken memories and uncertain futures. Bad Kreuznach, once a lively town with crowded markets and warm bakeries, now felt like an echo of itself. Buildings stood like skeletons, windows shattered, roofs sagging, as though the war had not ended but merely paused to catch its breath. Men returned from the front thin as their own shadows, women stood in endless queues for coal that rarely arrived, and children scavenged for firewood in forests nearly stripped bare. Hunger was no longer an intruder. It was a resident, familiar and relentless. For families like the Bauers, whose father had not returned from the Eastern Front and whose mother worked long hours sorting salvage at a ruined textile mill, each day became a delicate negotiation between despair and survival. Even the church bells, once a constant comfort, now rang with a hollowness that seemed to mock the promises they once carried. Franz had overheard the adults whispering the night before, there might be food coming. Not German food, not something from ration cards or the black market, but food from the Americans. The same Americans whose tanks had rolled through the town barely a year earlier, whose presence remained heavy in the minds of those who had lived through the war. He knew only scraps of adult conversation, fragments about relief shipments, care packages, and Americans helping the children because they didn't want Europe to collapse into chaos. But he also heard doubts. Some neighbors scoffed that it was propaganda, a trap, or charity meant to shame them. Others clung to the rumor as though it were a lifeline tossed into deep water. Franz, though young, had learned to keep his expectations small. Disappointment weighed too heavily when it landed. Yet something within him, a stubborn ember of hope, had convinced him to come early, pulling Greta along despite her sleepiness. Snow began to fall again, gently at first, drifting like pale feathers across the courtyard. Franz lifted his face toward the sky, letting a flake dissolve on his cheek. It reminded him of winters before the war, when his father built snowmen taller than he was and his mother made warm soup that filled the house with scents of onion and thyme. Greta didn't remember as much of those years. Most of her childhood had been defined by air raid sirens, shortages, and the sound of distant artillery. Franz sometimes wished he could trade memories with her so she could carry the better ones. A distant rumbling broke through the stillness, so faint at first that Franz wondered if he imagined it. The other children stirred, shifting their weight, craning their necks toward the road. Greta gripped his sleeve tightly, her eyes widening. The sound grew louder, steady, mechanical, unmistakable. Franz's pulse quickened. Trucks. Not the sputtering engines used by local farmers, but the deeper, heavier roar of military vehicles. The kind he had once watched roll past during the occupation, their tires leaving harsh tracks in the mud. Yet there was something different this time, something less threatening in the measured rhythm of the engines approaching. The children pressed toward the gate, careful but eager. Even the older boys, who usually tried to appear indifferent, stepped closer, their breath forming small plumes of anticipation. Franz felt Greta trembling beside him, not from fear but from something far more fragile, hope she didn't dare speak aloud. When the convoy came into view, 2 olive-gray trucks followed by a jeep, the courtyard seemed to hold its breath. The vehicles slowed, crunching over the frost-covered ground, and then came to a stop just outside the schoolyard. Soldiers began to climb down, their movements brisk against the cold. Their uniforms looked heavy, their faces red from the wind, and some carried large metal containers that steamed faintly in the frigid air. Franz's first instinct was to step back. Old memories of being told to hide from soldiers crawled up his spine. But Greta tugged at him, her gaze locked on the containers, and he found himself unable to move away. One of the American soldiers, a tall man with a scarf wrapped around half his face, noticed the cluster of children watching. He raised a hand in greeting. Not a command, not an order, just a simple gesture of acknowledgement. Franz felt Greta's grip loosen slightly. Teachers emerged from the schoolhouse, hurrying across the yard with cautious expressions. They exchanged a few hurried words with the soldiers, pointing toward the courtyard benches that had been cleared earlier that morning. The Americans nodded and began unloading the containers, setting them down with careful precision. Steam rose in thick clouds as one soldier unclamped the lid of a large pot. A warm, rich smell drifted into the icy air. The children leaned forward instinctively, their bodies drawn toward the scent as if pulled by invisible threads. It wasn't bread. It wasn't potato peel broth. It was something they hadn't smelled in months. Real, hot food. Franz felt something rise in his chest, something sharp and overwhelming, as if the cold inside him had begun to crack. Greta's eyes shone with a brightness he hadn't seen since before the war ended. The soldier with the scarf met Franz's gaze briefly, then gave a small nod as though to say, "It's all right now. You're safe." Franz swallowed hard, uncertain whether the warmth spreading through him came from the food's scent or the realization that these men, these former enemies, had come not with weapons but with sustenance. The courtyard seemed to shift around him, its bleakness briefly softened by the promise drifting from the steaming pots. And as the soldiers prepared the ladles and bowls, Franz realized that the world he thought he understood might be changing in ways he never imagined. Steam leapt upward in swirling white currents as the American soldier unclamped the metal lid, releasing a wave of heat that rolled across the frozen courtyard like a blessing. The smell, thick, warm, unmistakably rich, settled over the children in a hush, as if the very air had changed its temperature. For Franz, who had not tasted anything hot in weeks, the scent felt unreal, something dreamed rather than lived. Greta took a half-step forward, her fingers tightening around her tin bowl. The sound of clinking ladles echoed softly as more soldiers opened containers, each releasing another burst of fragrant steam that made the icy morning feel suddenly, impossibly alive. These men belonged to the 8th Infantry Division, though the badges on their jackets meant little to the children who watched them with wide, uncertain eyes. To Franz they were simply tall shadows in heavy coats, faces red from the cold, boots leaving deep impressions in the snow-dusted ground. A few soldiers exchanged quiet jokes with each other, their voices warm and rhythmic in a language that still felt foreign, though not as frightening as it once had. Most of the children had learned that tone mattered more than words. And today the tone was gentle. The tall soldier with the scarf, whose eyes held a tired kindness, picked up a ladle and glanced at the waiting crowd. Franz didn't know his name. He didn't need to. What mattered was the way the man moved. Deliberate, steady, as if he wanted to make sure nothing spilled, that not a single drop of the precious meal would be wasted. Another soldier beside him opened a wooden crate packed with small tins of something pale and sweet-smelling. Chocolate milk, Franz realized with a jolt. He had seen it only once, years ago, when his father brought home a can from a captured supply depot. Greta didn't remember that taste. Franz wondered if she would remember this one. A teacher stepped forward to help maintain order, but the soldiers waved off his worry with a quiet confidence that suggested they had done this many times before, in many towns just like this one. Relief operations, someone had whispered earlier. Care packages, feeding stations, foreign words that meant survival. The Americans had become part of a growing network of truck routes threading across the battered German countryside, carrying food into villages still trembling from the shock of defeat. But here, in this courtyard, those grand operations condensed into something small and intimate, the simple act of giving children a warm meal. Franz felt Greta press against his side as the line began to move, slow but steady. Steam continued to rise from the pots, spiraling upward into the pale winter sky. The scent grew stronger as they stepped closer, the comforting heaviness of cooked grains, a touch of butter, the faint sweetness of milk. Franz's stomach tightened painfully in anticipation. Greta tried to hide her excitement, but he could see it in the way her breath quickened, fogging the air in rapid bursts. When they reached the front of the line, the tall soldier crouched just enough to meet Greta's gaze. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he dipped the ladle into the pot. Thick, creamy grits poured into her bowl, steam curling around her small hands. She stared at the food for a moment, as if unsure it was real. The soldier hesitated, then added one more half ladle, a gesture so small yet so generous that Franz felt something tighten in his throat. When it was Franz's turn, the soldier paused again, studying him with a thoughtful expression, as though trying to measure hunger by height, by age, by the way Franz attempted to appear older than his years. The ladle poured into Franz's bowl with a satisfying weight. The warmth seeped into the metal, then into his palms. He hadn't realized how numb his hands were until they began to tingle with returning life. A soldier off to the side handed them each a small tin of chocolate milk. The tins were dented, labels smudged, but when Franz shook his, he could hear the liquid sloshing inside. Greta whispered his name, barely audible over the murmurs spreading through the courtyard. Her cheeks had already gained a faint rosy hue from the steam rising off the bowl she held so carefully. For a moment, she looked like the little sister he remembered before the war had carved shadows beneath her eyes. They stepped away from the serving station, finding a place along the school wall where a patch of weak sunlight had gathered. Greta dipped her spoon first, blowing on it with exaggerated care before placing it in her mouth. Her eyes widened. She covered her lips as if the taste startled her. Franz tasted his own spoonful and felt the heat flood through him, radiating down to his fingers and toes. The grits were soft, buttery, unfamiliar but comforting. It was the first food in months that carried warmth not just in temperature but in meaning. Around them, children ate in near silence, broken only by occasional gasps or whispered exclamations. The soldiers watched quietly, some leaning on their trucks, hands tucked into pockets. One soldier attempted to say "Guten Morgen" to a group of older boys, mispronouncing it badly. The boys tried to hide their laughter, but the soldier only grinned wider, shrugging as though to say, "At least I tried." For the first time in a long while, the courtyard held a sound other than hunger. Franz studied the Americans from where he sat. He expected to see sternness or arrogance, the kind of authority adults warned him about. But instead he saw exhaustion softened by purpose. Some soldiers had dark circles under their eyes, others carried a stiffness that suggested recent battles or long marches. Yet here they were, ladling food for children who had once been on the other side of the war's unforgiving line. Franz couldn't make sense of it. The world had shifted too fast, rewriting its roles before he could adjust. Greta leaned her head on his shoulder, still eating slowly, savoring each spoonful. "They're kind," she murmured, almost afraid of being overheard. Franz nodded but didn't answer. Kind wasn't a word he knew how to apply to men in uniform. And yet the evidence steamed gently between his hands. The tall soldier glanced their way again, offering a small wave. Greta lifted her hand shyly in return. Franz hesitated, then raised his hand too. A simple gesture, but heavy with something neither of them could name. As the last bowls were filled and the remaining children found their places in the courtyard, a murmur spread through the crowd. The teachers exchanged tense expressions. Franz followed their gaze toward the road, where another convoy of trucks was approaching. Not American this time. Not relief. Something else entirely. The sound of engines grew louder, sharper, cutting through the warm haze of the meal. The tall soldier straightened, eyes narrowing as he watched the vehicles draw closer. Franz felt the warmth in his hands begin to drain, replaced by a creeping unease. Whatever was coming next carried the unmistakable weight of trouble, and the fragile peace of the moment trembled on the edge of breaking. The trucks that appeared on the road were not hostile, but their sudden arrival carried a tension that rippled through the courtyard. They were German municipal vehicles, battered and soot-stained, their engines coughing as they crawled through the gate. Civil administrators stepped out, Thin men in oversized coats, faces strained, clipboards tucked beneath their arms. They looked wary of the Americans, wary of the watching children, and perhaps wary of their own uncertain authority. Their presence reminded everyone present that Germany was a nation trying to stand again on unsteady legs, and that the hunger haunting its cities was not something even a single convoy of American trucks could dispel. One of the administrators, a gray-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses, approached the tall American soldier. Their exchange was cordial but taut, punctuated by long silences and stiff gestures. Papers were handed over, signatures scrawled, lists compared. Franz watched from a distance, clutching his now empty bowl. He didn't understand the words, but he sensed the stakes. This wasn't simply a meal. It was a negotiation over how a broken nation could be kept alive without losing what little dignity it still clung to. In the days that followed, the feeding stations became a routine. At dawn, the 8th Infantry Division trucks rolled through the town square, carrying tins of oats, crates of flour, powdered milk, dried fruit, and the coveted chocolate milk tins that made children whisper excitedly even before the engines appeared. The Americans unloaded quickly, moving with practiced efficiency. The teachers organized the lines. The German administrators tried to keep records, though their pencil stubs were nearly worn down to nothing. Franz and Greta returned each morning, bowls in hand, drawn not just by hunger but by something else. Curiosity, gratitude, perhaps even fascination. They began to recognize the soldiers by their mannerisms. The tall one with the scarf who always added a bit extra to Greta's bowl. The stocky one who hummed fragments of songs while he worked. The young soldier who tried each day to pronounce German words and failed spectacularly. These small attempts at connection softened the grimness of the courtyard, turning it into a place where warmth could briefly outshine the cold. Yet beneath this daily ritual lay a deeper, hidden struggle, one that Franz sensed only in fragments. He overheard adults debating whether accepting food from former enemies was shameful or necessary. Rumors circulated of cities where children fainted in classrooms or families tore pages from books to burn for heat. Relief shipments, people whispered, were arriving too slowly. Trains were stalled on bomb-cratered tracks. Entire regions were still digging out from the rubble. The Americans were helping, yes, but the need was so vast it felt like trying to fill a cracked basin with handfuls of water. It took time for Franz to grasp the truth. The feeding stations were part of something much larger, a coordinated effort stretching across the ruins of Europe. The Americans were not simply acting out of kindness. They were following a strategy shaped by fear as much as compassion. Soldiers spoke quietly about preventing collapse, about keeping Germany from sliding into extremism again, about the danger of desperate people turning to desperate ideologies. Food was not just sustenance. It was an anchor, a stabilizer, a tool to keep chaos from re-emerging in a land still trembling from the war's aftermath. One afternoon, while waiting in line, Franz overheard two soldiers discussing the numbers. Millions of care packages had already been shipped. School kitchens across what would soon become West Germany served meals to nearly 3.5 million children each day. The scale was staggering, even if Franz could not fully comprehend it. He only knew that the bowl in his hands was part of something enormous, something that stretched beyond Bad Kreuznach, beyond the boundaries of his own small life. The people in town began to change too. Suspicion softened into tentative trust. A few mothers began greeting the soldiers with shy nods. Shopkeepers left small bundles of firewood or apples, scarce though they were, beside the trucks in quiet appreciation. Children stopped flinching when soldiers approached. Even the stern German administrators seemed less rigid, though they still clung to their clipboards as if order itself depended on their grip. But not everyone welcomed the shift. Franz noticed it first in the whispers. Men muttering that Germany should feed its own, that relying on Americans was humiliating, that the old ways had been swept aside too quickly. Some called the relief efforts a hidden occupation, claiming the Americans were buying loyalty with warm meals. Others feared that resentment would grow among adults who remembered the war too vividly to accept help from those who had once marched through their streets with rifles drawn. One cold morning, the tension surfaced openly. A group of older teenagers lingered near the school wall, watching the Americans with narrowed eyes. Their postures were rigid, their hands stuffed in their pockets, their expressions hard. Franz recognized one of them as the son of a man who often ranted about foreign interference during ration lines. The boys did not approach the soldiers, but their silent hostility cast a shadow across the courtyard. The tall soldier noticed them too, his hand pausing mid-ladle, his gaze flicking toward them with quiet concern. Later that afternoon, after most of the children had gone home, Franz lingered behind to return a bowl to the cleaning station. He found the tall soldier repairing a loose shutter on the side of the schoolhouse. The soldier worked slowly, hammering each nail with careful precision. For a moment, the sound of the hammer filled the courtyard, solid, steady, strangely reassuring. Franz watched from a few paces away, unsure whether to speak. The soldier noticed him, offered a small nod, and then returned to his work without a word. It was in that silent rhythm that Franz understood something new. The feeding station was not just about hunger. It was about rebuilding, quietly, painstakingly, one small gesture at a time. The soldier hammered because the shutter was broken, because the school needed to stand again, because children needed a place that did not tremble with fear. When the soldier finished, he rested the hammer at his side and looked out toward the road where the next day's trucks would arrive. The sunlight caught the metal rim of Franz's bowl, still damp from washing. The soldier's gaze lingered on it, on Franz, and then on the horizon, as if he could already see something approaching that would change everything once more. And when Franz followed that gaze, he felt a faint echo of unease stir within him, a sense that the quiet stability they were beginning to trust might soon be challenged by forces no bowl of warm food could keep at bay. Years later, when Franz Bauer became an adult with lines of responsibility etched into his face, he would still remember the first warm bowl of grits placed in his hands by a man who had once been called his enemy. He remembered it not because of the taste, but because of what it symbolized, the moment the world cracked open and allowed something unexpected to enter. But in those early months after the feeding station began, he was still just a thin boy with cold fingers and a sister who clung to him each morning as though he could shield her from every unkindness the winter threw their way. Greta changed first. Her cheeks gradually regained softness, a faint glow that pushed away the hollowed look she had carried through the hungry months. She laughed again, quietly at first, as though testing whether laughter was still permitted. Children who receive warmth after long exposure to fear learn to cherish it with an intensity that remains with them all their lives. Franz watched her recover piece by piece and realized he himself was changing too. He no longer expected danger with every sound of an engine. He no longer assumed uniformed men meant violence. The Americans had disrupted something inside him, a belief he didn't know he had held, that enemies remained enemies forever. The feeding station expanded as spring approached. More children arrived from neighboring villages, their shoes patched with twine, their coats so thin they barely held back the wind. The soldiers brought larger pots and more crates, sometimes working until their breaths turned to fog in the fading afternoon light. They joked with the teachers, exchanged cigarettes with the German administrators, and built a rapport that seemed impossible just a year earlier. Some soldiers pinned drawings given by the younger children to the sides of their trucks, stick figures with oversized boots and smiling faces. The tall soldier with the scarf kept one tucked in the breast pocket of his jacket, folded carefully so it wouldn't tear. Franz never learned his name, but he began to sense the man's presence the way he could see over the line and know she hadn't been forgotten. Or the afternoon when Franz, carrying his empty bowl home, caught sight of two German administrators and an American sergeant repairing the school fence together, their tools clattering in a rhythm strangely reminiscent of hope. Trust grew slowly but surely. Children began greeting soldiers with shy waves. Parents, initially wary, started sending thanks through the teachers. Even the teenagers who once glared from the walls drifted closer, curiosity overpowering resentment. Hunger, it seemed, had carved out a space in which humanity could reroot itself. Yet Franz sensed something else brewing, an uneasiness beneath the fragile harmony. He noticed it when the tall soldier paused more often, scanning the horizon as if expecting bad news. He saw it in the hurried conversations among the teachers and administrators, and he felt it in the increasing weight of the soldiers' movements, as though their time in Bad Kreuznach was nearing an end. Relief efforts were expanding to other regions. Troops were being reassigned. Nothing, even kindness, lasted untouched. On a gray afternoon toward the end of spring, Franz found the tall soldier standing alone near the trucks, a paper in his hand, his expression unreadable. The courtyard was empty. The feeding for the day had already finished. The soldier folded the paper slowly, tucking it inside his coat. When he noticed Franz watching, he managed a faint smile, gentle, but tinged with something that made Franz's chest tighten. The soldier hesitated, as if searching for words he didn't know how to translate. At last he knelt, placed his gloved hand lightly on Franz's shoulder, and sensed the warmth of the sun breaking through clouds. The soldier would nod to him each morning, sometimes slipping an extra spoonful into Greta's bowl. It wasn't favoritism. It was quiet understanding, the sort forged not through words but through shared struggle. And though Franz still didn't speak English, he learned to read the soldier's expressions. A quick grin when a child cracked a joke, a shadow of worry when the trucks from other towns arrived late, a softness when he watched the thinnest children eat with trembling hands. But the conflict beneath the surface had not faded. Franz could feel it in the conversations carried by adults walking home from the station. Some insisted that accepting food from Americans would erode German pride. Others saw the relief effort as a bridge toward a future that desperately needed rebuilding. Even within the American units, soldiers argued over how long they should stay, whether charity to former enemies risked angering their own families back home who were still grieving wartime losses. Compassion and caution coexisted uneasily, like two mismatched gears grinding toward the same direction. One morning, Franz overheard two teachers discussing rumors of a new initiative, something larger than the feeding stations, something involving billions of dollars, reconstruction plans, and a vision for preventing Europe from collapsing into another war. He didn't understand the details, but he caught the name repeated with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The Marshall Plan. At the time it was only a proposal, a fragile promise in a world still healing. Yet even whispered, it seemed to shift the air around the courtyard. Help wasn't just coming day by day. A future was being outlined. For Franz, that future arrived in moments too small for adults to notice. Like the day Greta offered her chocolate milk to another girl who looked close to fainting. Or the morning he saw the tall soldier lift a child onto his shoulders, so gave a single nod, a gesture that carried gratitude, farewell, and something deeper that Franz would only understand years later. Then the soldier rose, climbed into the truck, and for a moment simply sat there, his gaze fixed on the courtyard where children had gathered each morning. When the engine finally rumbled to life, Franz stood rooted to the ground, watching as the truck pulled away, its tires crushing the last traces of winter frost. He didn't cry. Neither did Greta when he told her. But that night, as Franz lay awake listening to the quiet settling over the street, he realized that the warmth the Americans had brought was more fragile than he had imagined, and that something unseen was arriving to replace them, something that would test the fragile hope they had sown. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.